who knows which genius it is, but we all owe him a very great debt of gratitude. Someone eventually came up with the idea of mixing that powder with milk, and hence we have chocolate. So there's a whole lot of causes that have led up to the existence of chocolate. But we can easily imagine a world in which any one of those causes didn't exist, was missing in the chain of causality, and therefore we wouldn't have chocolate in the world. We could really say that about everything else in the world, nice and not nice. We could say that about each one of us. We only exist because a certain set of specific events occurred that led up to each of us individuals existing in this world. Can we generalize that to everything in the world? I don't think there's any rational reason why we shouldn't. So can we say that then about the world in general? And by the world in general, I don't mean planet Earth, our world, I mean the universe, all that exists. Is it not a valid question to ask, why does the universe exist? It seems that the universe existing is a much more complex state of affairs than the universe not existing. So this is the question that we're asking today. Why should anything exist in the first place? What are we going to try and do today? Okay, hopefully over the next 2.5 hours, with a break in between, don't worry. We're going to look at this thorny question and look at some of the attempts to answer it, or one particular attempt to answer it, which has inspired our night tonight by a scientist called Lawrence Krauss. Before we pick apart what he says, we're first going to ask the question, how can we be sure that something really does exist? Maybe this universe is a dream. Maybe it's an illusion. Maybe there is no reality. Before we ask why does something exist rather than nothing, we have to make sure that something exists. Otherwise the question is meaningless. Yeah? Yes. That's very profound. There may be no reality, just perception. Let's think about that. We're going to come to that in a little while. Okay, and then we're going to have to ask, what is nothing? What do we mean when we say nothing? Because Lawrence Krauss's idea of nothing may be different to other people's idea of nothing. We'll find out. Okay, then we're going to launch into our chief investigation. Can we answer this question scientifically? Can we answer it philosophically? Or can we answer it religiously? And what is the best answer in the end? And then hopefully we'll conclude, by which time you'll be utterly and totally convinced that, well, I won't spoil it. Yes, I will. This is what I'm going to convince you of. This is what I'm going to argue today. And feel free to disagree with what I say. Feel free to challenge it. Okay, we want to find out how strong this argument actually is. My argument will be that the question, why is there something rather than nothing, will lead us to the conclusion that the best answer is a causeless first cause. Or I should probably have written an uncaused first cause, because that's confusing. An uncaused first cause. I'm going to argue that this uncaused first cause is actually a necessary being, that actually nothing would exist if he didn't exist. And the very fact that anything does exist proves that he exists. Okay? Yes, I hope I'm not biting off more than I can chew. You will judge by the end of tonight. That I'm further going to argue that this first cause, or another title we could call it, is a ground of all being, foundation of all existence, in other words, bears a remarkable similarity to the God of Orthodox Christianity. If we take his fingerprint, it'll match up to the fingerprint in the Bible, is what I'm going to say. And finally, though, this question alone does not by itself lead to Christian faith, but at most a deistic faith. Okay, we need to explain the difference here between deistic and theistic. So a deist is someone who believes that God exists and that God is the source of everything that exists, but does not necessarily believe that God is a personal God. Okay, he may just be like a force or something like that. A theist is someone like a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew who believes in a God who is a personal God, who actually takes an interest and interacts with his creation. So really, as we ask this question, why is there something rather than nothing? I think, and you'll judge by the end, I think that we can show pretty strongly that a God who is a creator of everything must exist. But taken by itself, this argument just by itself doesn't necessarily lead you to believe in the God of Christianity. Although, as I said, the fingerprints match. There's a lot of similarities. But I could see how someone who's very skeptical could say, okay, I might accept that a creator exists, but you would still have to prove to me that that creator is the Christian God. And of course, there are many other arguments that we can put for it being the Christian God, which we're not going to do tonight. We're just focusing on this one question. Okay. So, any questions at this stage? Please feel free to dive in and save me from my quagmire and generate interesting discussion as we go. Okay. Oh, yes, the free thinkers. Yeah. I'll do my best. Okay, I can't guarantee that, but we'll do my best. So long as I'm not confused, there's a good chance you won't be. But I can't guarantee me not being confused either. Okay, let's have a go. So, can anyone think of an alternative to these two options? Either there is something or there is nothing. Anybody got a third possibility? No? No, I don't think so either. I think because the something could be, I mean, there may be a variety of somethings. Existence could have been one single atom, for example, and that's the whole universe. Or it could be, you know, a universe 1,000,000 times as big as our universe, but something is something, and the absence of something is nothing. So really, they're the only two things we're interested in. We're not really interested tonight in the character of the something. We just are interested that there is something. Okay, and we can imagine that there's nothing. Okay, what about this? Would anyone disagree if I said that nothing seems to be the default position? That without some good reason for something to exist, the default position should be that nothing should exist. Do you get what I'm saying? Have I confused you yet? I have? Okay, so what I'm saying is, the simplest of all possible scenarios would be that nothing exists. If something exists, we now have complicated the question by, and you'd have to have a cause for something existing, whereas you don't need a cause for nothing existing. Anybody want to disagree so far? Okay, so we're starting off with nothing. And what we're saying is that all things being equal, if there are no causes, then there should be no universe. There should be nothing at all. And I just want to also point out before we go on that why is there something rather than nothing is slightly different to the question of how did it all begin? Because how did it all begin involves time, whereas why is there something rather than nothing doesn't necessarily need to involve time. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Okay. What you're talking about is, okay, we're actually sort of going to come to it in a little while. So there's this thing called the anthropic principle, which we'll talk about when we get to it. But I think my response would be, think of it this way. You're saying we are here and we are trying to explain why we are here. That's kind of what you're saying? So therefore the default position must be that something exists, because if it didn't exist, we wouldn't be here to be asking that question. That's what you're saying. Okay, what I'm saying is step outside of yourself for a minute, okay? Be an impartial, unembodied intelligence, okay? Imagine that and you can imagine that none of us exist. You can imagine that there is no one here to ask the question. Because that is the simplest of scenarios. No, thank you. That's a good question. Because what I'm suggesting to you is that that is the very, very simplest of scenarios. For us to be here, there must be a cause, as I said at the beginning. We wouldn't be here unless there were certain events that had happened for us to be here to be asking that question. What I'm suggesting to you is a much simpler scenario would have been if we weren't here at all. And what I'm saying is the default position should be the simplest position. The default position should be the one where you have no causes. And then you can start to hypothetically introduce causes and see what happens. Yeah. Do you get what I'm saying? It's a bit like saying, what's the default position for having... Okay, here we are sitting in a church. We could sit in this church and ask, why is this church here? Okay, according to the argument that you're proposing, our answer would be something along the lines of course it's here because we are sitting in here having a church meeting. That's why it's here. Okay. What I'm suggesting to you is we need to go much further back than that. Back to the time when this was just empty land. Back to the Aboriginal era, when there was nothing here at all. And if we really want to know why the church exists, that's how far back we have to go, and then start building the picture from nothing. And if you really want to go further back, go back to Gondwana land, and then go back to, the interstellar dust that gradually formed the sun and the earth, all the way back to the Big Bang if you want. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, or at least you'll concede it for now. Okay, so the answers to this question, why is there something rather than nothing, fall into three broad categories which occasionally overlap, and they're the three that we're going to look at tonight. There are religious answers, which are probably the oldest. There are philosophical answers, which are next in age, and then there are scientific answers, which are the most recent ones, because science, of course, is the youngest of those three. And here is the argument that we'll be looking at, which is probably the most popular answer, certainly the one that has caused the biggest media frenzy. This is a book that was published last year by Lawrence M. Krauss, who, by the way, is a highly respected scientist and a very learned man and a very intelligent man. But you immediately know there's something wrong when you read under the author's name, Afterword by Richard Dawkins. That rings some alarm bells. Okay, what does our friend Lawrence say? Basically, and I'm very, I'm simplifying a 200-page book into one PowerPoint slide. Okay, so please understand that. Okay, I'm sure there's a lot of complexities that didn't get in here. Okay, basically this is what he says. We know that out of the nothing of empty space arise somethings. What does he mean? For example, in the vacuum of space, way out in space, we believe that all the time pairs of matter are popping into existence. So you have nothing, empty space. Suddenly, a proton and an antimatter, antiproton, pop out of the vacuum of space. Now, most of the time what happens to them is they immediately get attracted to each other because they're opposite charges, and they collide with each other, and when matter and antimatter collide, they annihilate again. So they pop out of existence. Okay, so are we comfortable about that? How do we know this, you might ask? Nobody wants to ask? Thank you. Well, let me tell you. Well, apparently, another famous scientist, Stephen Hawking, I won't even try and do his voice, although it's a very nice voice. The one with the, you know, electronic voice box and stuff. Anyway, he discovered back in the 1970s this thing called Hawking radiation. And basically it's really simple. You've heard of black holes, haven't you? So a black hole is a star that's collapsed under the force of its own gravity, and it's become so dense that its gravity is incredibly strong. And its gravity is so strong that light itself can't escape from the black hole. So you know how if you've got a tennis ball, no matter how hard you threw it up into the air, it'll always come back down. If, on the other hand, you put it on the tip of a rocket and sent it off, you know, with a rocket, then it would escape. Well, a rocket would not be able to escape from a black hole because its gravity is so strong. Light itself, a photon of light, gets dragged back into a black hole. With me so far? So imagine a black hole. Now, the further you go from a black hole, the weaker its gravity gets. Agreed? There must be some point towards the end of the you know, far away from a black hole, a sphere of space, where things are just on the tipping point of either being attracted into the black hole or escaping from the black hole's gravity, because it's just on the point of being so weak that it can't affect them anymore. So what he discovered is this. He discovered that when these matter and antimatter bits pop out of empty space, if they're going in the right directions, and if they're right on the edge of that region we're talking about, the edge of the sphere of the influence of gravity, one of them will get sucked into the black hole, the other one won't, because they're going off in different directions. And therefore, his prediction was that black holes shouldn't be black. You should actually be able to see them, because the particle that escapes then can be picked up by our sensors as a photon or as a, you know, an electron or whatever it might be that popped out. And therefore this is called Hawking radiation, and it's been experimentally verified that it actually exists. And the only way apparently that it could come about is if matter and antimatter are constantly popping into existence out of empty space. So Lawrence Krauss is really excited about this because he doesn't believe in God. And he says, look, here we have nothing. Empty space is nothing. And out of that empty space, we have a scientific process. It has nothing to do with religion, has nothing to do with God. It's simply a law of nature that matter pops out of existence in empty space, in the nothingness of empty space. Why, therefore, couldn't everything that exists, all of this universe that we know, have just popped out of empty space in the same way without the intervention of God? To take it further, there are some models of our own universe that suggest that it might be possible that little bubble universes are constantly popping out of empty space as well, and that our own universe actually was a little bubble universe that popped out of some other universe. Now, if a bubble universe popped out of nothing here in the middle of this church, we'd be in big trouble. Because if it behaved like our universe, it would very quickly expand and we'd all be annihilated and become, you know, nothing. Okay, we'd just be squished into, I don't know what we would be. Very, very, very flat pancakes. Okay. But thankfully, bubble universes have never been detected, and it is only theoretical at the moment. But he's saying, there you go. Why do we need God? Matter can pop out of nothing. We think universes can pop out of nothing. So the need for a creator God has been eliminated. It's gone. And this is the argument of his book. He and a number of other people, a number of other scientists. Okay. What's wrong with this argument? Before we go any further, please give me your thoughts. Yes. What do you mean? And could you use a microphone? Two very deep questions.
The definition that they've used, Krauss and Dawkins, the nothing includes the empty space in itself, and that their theories exist in the deep space itself. It's not completely nothing, though. There's still.
So you're saying that empty space is not nothing?
Pretty much.
What is it?
It's, yeah.
What is it? Okay. I'll take that as a comment. Yeah. Because we're going to come back and thrash it out later on. But yeah, anyone else? Anyone else want to put forward an idea? Yes? Was that a yes or a no? Marianne? Yeah.
I want to know, how can you have a proton, which is matter, and antimatter, and then when you have the two of them come together, they just pop out of no existence? Like you had matter, and then you don't have matter anymore.
Okay, it comes back to the nature of antimatter. So I don't think anybody really understands what antimatter is, but they seem to have worked out the mathematical formulae and laws of physics that describe its behaviour. And it seems to have been proved that it is real in a number of experiments. So I agree with you, it's this really counterintuitive, weird sort of idea, antimatter. But here's an interesting thought. If there were an antimatter Marianne, and if you ever met your antimatter counterpart, please don't shake hands or hug her, because both of you would cease to exist. Okay, it's think of it mathematically. What's +1 + -1?
Yeah, I agree. That makes
Gives
sense.
you 0. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's basically, yeah.
Just the fact that there is matter and then there's no matter.
But antimatter isn't no matter. Antimatter is matter with different properties. It's the opposite of matter. Okay, positive matter and negative matter, if you like.
Maybe get a third colour altogether and imagine that third colour is not. Okay, yeah.
That could be one way of thinking of it. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Look, the language they use, yeah, while they exist, they're both something, definitely. We are made of matter. We are made of normal matter. People, speculate that there might be antimatter planets out there, for example. Nobody's ever found anything that could possibly be, but it's not an impossibility. It's thought that, the matter in the universe greatly outnumbers the antimatter, because apparently the thought is at the Big Bang, there was a lot of both, but there was a very slight, there was a slightly greater amount of matter than there was antimatter. So the great amount of both all annihilated each other, and that's why the universe is mostly empty. And the slightly more matter that existed than the antimatter is what we now call normal matter. That's the stuff that makes stars and planets and human beings. But apparently could very easily have gone the other way, apparently. If there was a little bit more antimatter than matter, then we would all be made of antimatter, except we would probably call that matter, wouldn't we? And we would call what we call matter antimatter. Okay, now I'm confusing myself, so let's not... No, apparently antimatter has been experimentally proven to exist. Okay. Yes. Now I'm not sure. We're getting beyond my level of knowledge here. I'm not sure. Perhaps I'm not sure if they actually created sometimes in those really big colliders. Sorry. Yeah, and I don't know. Look, I think antimatter has charge. So if you apply a magnetic field, it reacts to it. I suppose you could find it by annihilating matter with it. So if you take a proton and make it touch something which you think is there, and the proton suddenly disappears, it's probably a good guess that that was antimatter that you touched. I don't know. Do you have any more knowledge on the matter? Oh, can you just grab the microphone though? So.
For matter to exist, it must have an energy to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to say who, but what gave it that energy in the first place? For it to collide or to separate?
Okay. So you're saying the popping out of nothing of matter and antimatter.
Or the collision of them.
Or the collision of it. Well, once it exists, it has energy, so that explains the collision, I suppose. But you're saying what makes it pop out of nothing in the first place? That's a good question. You're thinking of that, okay. Okay, we'll come back to it. Let's see what we can say about it. We'll come back to it later. But first, we're going to need to make sure that there is something. Is there really something? Can we be sure that anything exists? Do I exist? How can you be sure that I exist? Convince me that I exist. Go ahead. How do you know your perception is accurate? How do you know you're not dreaming this? Yeah? Okay, physical pain is a perception. How do you know that's not in the dream? Yeah? That's exactly right, yeah. Okay, let me give you a scenario. If an evil scientist decided to take a brain, put it in a bottle or a jar, hook up electrodes to it, connect the electrodes to a computer, and he was so clever that he could program this whole world. Now remember, he doesn't need to build the world. All he needs to do is send the right electrical impulses into the right bits of your brain to make you feel a slap on the face, or see a Buna sitting in front of you, or hear my voice. How would you tell the difference? Yeah?
I think for this question, it doesn't really matter. I think the fact that, like, I think you got the answer up there, that I think, therefore I am. So whether we're a body in the matrix or some mad scientist, or if we're just some sort of programmed code or something, it's something. There is something existing. So we can't be sure, I can't be 100% sure that you're real, but I can be 100% sure that my thoughts are real because I'm experiencing them firsthand. So something exists.
Yeah. Excellent, yes. And yes, what I've got up there is René Descartes, who was a 17th century philosopher, who basically took skepticism to its extreme. Okay, and he basically decided in the end he had no way of being 100% certain that anything was real or that anything even existed. He didn't use a mad scientist with electrodes, because this is the 17th century. They hadn't invented either electrodes or scientists, for that matter. But he came up with an evil demon who takes your brain and puts it in a jar and feeds in ideas and stuff like that. And basically, and this is a question, by the way, that up until today continues to be debated. And to my knowledge, nobody has ever really conclusively solved it. We all live our lives as if the world was real, and that makes a lot of sense, and it works. But to my knowledge, nobody has ever actually conclusively shown that the world is real. But basically, the bit that interests us tonight is he came up with this. If I am asking the question, does anything exist? There must be something that is asking the question. Therefore, the thing that is asking the question must exist. And that's his cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The very fact that I am thinking is conclusive proof that at least one thing exists. Me. Me as in the thinking thing. Whatever it is that's doing the thinking must exist. So we're going to take that, okay? We, as I said, we're not interested in what the something is. We just want to say there is something. So we're going to overcome this question of does anything exist by answering yes, at least me, the thinking thing, definitely does exist. So yes, we do need to find an answer to the question, why does something exist? And later on we can argue about whether the world is real or not. Okay. Can science answer this question of why is there something rather than nothing? So let's go back to our friend Lawrence Krauss. For him, nothing is the vacuum of space. That's nothing because there's nothing there. From this, he claims the subatomic particles, possibly bubble universes, are popping out all the time, and that explains why our universe exists and why there is something rather than nothing. Okay, first thing to be said here, we need to understand what the nature of science is. And we had a topic on this a few months ago, I think, as well. The nature of science is to deal with the how of things. Science, in essence, describes rather than, strictly speaking, explains. It describes things that already exist. Science, they call it empirical, which means that science means you have to go out and you have to test things. So someone just sitting in their armchair, using only their brain to work out how the world works, is not a scientist by today's standards, or at least an incomplete scientist. Science insists that you have to go out and make sure reality fits the model that your brain came up with. Can science do that in this case? Okay, science is not built to answer why questions. So we might say that this is a why question. Why is there something rather than nothing? We're asking for a reason. Does that reason fall under the purview of science? Lawrence Krauss has made a lot of enemies. And do you know who they are? They're not Christians. They're philosophers, professional philosophers, including mostly atheist philosophers. And he hasn't improved his relationship with philosophers because he has actually come out in public and said that philosophy is stupid. Philosophy has no role in the modern world. Philosophy is a dead way of doing things and we don't need it anymore. Stephen Hawking actually came out and said philosophy is dead. There's no point. What's the point of philosophy? Science is going to answer all of our questions. What's wrong with that reasoning? The philosophers, of course, come back and say, hey, mate, if they're Australian philosophers, of which there are some very good ones, hey, mate, you couldn't do your science if it wasn't for us. And they're quite right, because science itself is built on a philosophical foundation. Science deals with the real world. We just saw that philosophy questions even the reality of the world. If philosophy one day came out with a really conclusive argument that the world doesn't really exist, then guess what? Science is meaningless. They're investigating something that doesn't exist. Not only that, the way that science works. How do we know that the scientific method works? You can't prove science with science. Yeah? But just
prove that the claim that science can explain everything via the scientific method, it is actually a philosophical question to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. What you just said, okay, does science work, is not something that you can go out and experiment. Because if you go out and do a scientific experiment to prove that science works, you're already assuming that science works. Otherwise, you wouldn't accept the results of the scientific experiment. Why do you accept the results of the scientific experiment? Because you already believe that science works. How do you know science works? Because I proved it with the experiment. Why do you believe the experiment? Because science works. How do you know science works? Because I proved it with the experiment. Why do you believe the experiment? Because science works. Okay, it's your classical circular argument. It doesn't work. So people like Krauss who are saying science will answer everything, not just in our opinion as Christians, but in the opinion of philosophers as well, including atheistic philosophers, have really got it wrong. And they say to him, look, you stick to your particle accelerators and leave us to answer the why questions. And I think they have a very good argument in saying that. Yeah. That's true. That's true. That's yeah, and not only that, but today's scientific theory is, goes in tomorrow's garbage can when a new one comes along as well, and so on. So yeah, very good point. Thank you for that. Okay. Now, the scientists might come back and say, maybe this isn't a why question. Maybe this is really a how question. Let me just fiddle the words a little bit. How is it that something exists rather than nothing? Haven't I just made it into a scientific question? Why not? What do you mean? And could you say it into a microphone so everyone can hear you?
It's not a question that focuses on facts, whereas if science is just about facts, then...
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone care to add their 2 cents worth to that? I agree with you, by the way. No, you're all being very quiet today. Okay. I'll try and think of some controversial questions to stir you up. Yes, basically that's exactly right. Science is basically dealing with facts, with realities. What we are actually asking now is, how does reality itself come to exist? Okay, science deals inside the circle of reality. We're actually asking how that circle got there in the first place. And that's outside the realm of science. No matter what words you put it into, this is not something that science can go out and do an experiment about. Okay, so what we're looking for is what it is that allows science to take place in the first place, the origins of reality itself. Science describes reality, but it cannot explain why reality exists. So the answer to our question can't come from scientific observation and scientific description and so on of what it is. Okay, this brings us to the question of what is nothing. Mina challenged Lawrence Krauss's definition of nothing earlier on. Richard did. Sorry, it was Richard. Sorry, Richard. So, is empty space nothing? Okay, that's his argument, just to remind ourselves. Krauss says that nothing is the vacuum of space. Out of this vacuum of space, which is defined as nothing, we get subatomic particles and maybe bubble universes popping out, and therefore we don't need God to explain where something comes from, why reality exists. Okay, what's wrong? Is his nothing really nothing? Okay, and Richard started to send us in this direction. I think the vacuum of empty space has at least three somethings in it. Number one is the laws of nature. That's something. Okay? Even in the vacuum of empty space, everybody agrees the laws of nature still apply. Why? Why should there be laws of nature? That's something that needs to be explained. That's something that needs a cause to explain why it exists. Dimensions of space and time, which is what Richard was saying, I think. Okay? Even empty space actually has dimensions. Even if there is no matter and no energy in that empty space whatsoever, the fact that we can call it space means that, let's take a cube of 1 meter cubed, okay, way out in empty space where there is nothing at all. At the very least, we can say that there are dimensions there. It's not chaos. It's not, okay, I don't know what the opposite of that is. It's not dimensionless. It has dimensions, okay, and it has time. Does time pass if there is no matter or energy? That's actually a philosophical question as well that people ask. If there was nothing, if there was no matter or energy in the world, would time still pass? Or is time just a property of matter? But, some people would say, yeah, in that cube of empty space, time doesn't stop, time still continues. Sorry? Oh, this is a really big topic, which I'm not sure we want to broach at the moment. What is time? I think what you're talking about is the concept of measuring time. So yes, that is definitely something that human beings invented. But when we measure time, many people, not everybody, would say that we are actually measuring something that's real, that exists whether we measure it or not, whether we're there to measure it or not. Okay, on Alpha Centauri there are no human beings to measure time, but as far as we can tell, time still goes on there. So it's like a real thing. So in our cubic meter of empty space, I think we can make a good case that time exists. If a particle whizzes through that cubic meter of empty space, there must be a time before it enters, a time when it's inside the cube, and a time when it leaves, a time after it's entered. So that's a good argument, isn't it? That there is time even. So there is space and time, even in the vacuum of empty space. And apparently there's this scientific concept that I don't understand terribly well called vacuum energy. So apparently a vacuum itself has energy. So think of this. How does your vacuum cleaner work? Oh, come on. Yussi just said it sucks. Did you mean that? As a pun? Okay. Basically what it does is, you're right, it sucks the air out of a chamber, leaving a partial vacuum. What is it then that makes the other end want to whiz in? Okay, there's some kind of energy going on there, some kind of attractive force. So even empty space has this energy somehow involved. I don't understand it very well, and I've probably explained it very badly. But again, that's something, that's not nothing. That's something that's there. So Krauss's solution of something coming out of nothing fails at least on this level, because he's not actually starting with nothing. He hasn't explained where the cube of empty space came from. He hasn't explained why it exists rather than not existing. Okay, any comments so far? Okay, so, yep, go ahead. If we can get a microphone, that'd be really great.
You sort of just defined what isn't nothing, but what is nothing? Like, what do we actually mean? Because we've never actually measured nothing. Like, you know what I mean? So what is?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What is nothing? Basically. Anyone care to answer that? I'll share my thoughts with you after you've had a go. Anyone, go ahead. Come on, don't be shy. The absence of something. So, okay, or could I tweak that a little bit and say the absence of everything? Yeah. Are you happy with that definition? Or not really?
Yes, that's correct.
You agree? I'll take that as a comment. Marianne has something to say, I think.
I was just going to say, no. So does that mean that you can never have nothing if it's an ordered universe?
Sorry, say that again.
Can you never have nothing if it's an ordered universe? Because you always have natural laws.
Yes, I would agree with that, yeah. Yeah, even if this universe was empty of matter and energy, that would still not be nothing. Anyone disagree? So to have genuine nothing, you'd not have space, you would not have time, you would not have your vacuum energy, you would not have laws of nature. In the history of the universe, no. But what about outside the history of the universe? Yes, that's what we don't know. Okay. Sorry?
The alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end.
Yeah.
So
yes.
Obviously that there was something in the beginning who was God.
Well, the Christian would say that only God existed.
Yeah.
And nothing else. And we don't know the nature of God. We don't understand the nature of God. So therefore, we can't imagine what that would be like for God alone to exist. But maybe we shouldn't be too surprised at that, because just as we can't imagine nothing, we can't imagine infinity either. Try this simple experiment. Imagine, picture in your mind a line that has no ends. Can you picture that in your mind? I've wasted hours of my life sitting there trying to actually picture a line without ends, and I just can't do it. No, but that's, okay, see, that's endless but finite, okay? You only need a limited number of atoms to make a circle. You need an infinite number of atoms to make a line, a straight line, without ends. Okay, you can't imagine it. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised that we can't imagine what nothing is. Maybe that's the answer to your question, Justine. We can't imagine it. Okay, but just because we can't imagine something doesn't mean that it can't exist. There must be many, many things that our brains are not equipped to imagine, and yet we can think about them as a concept. We can think that they could exist, they could be, and we could even determine some things about them, even if we can't imagine them. So, yes, that's what the religious person would say. The scientist has a problem here, because she can't assume that there was ever nothing. We're going to come to that in a minute. Okay, so the question remains, why does something exist if we start with the default position of nothing? Science by its nature seems incapable of answering this question. Okay. Before we go on, does anybody have any other scientific answers that I haven't thought of or come across? Anyone know, read about any answers of why is there something rather than nothing? Anyone do better than Lawrence Krauss, who has failed miserably? No? Okay, let's keep going. What about philosophy then? Let's leave science behind. Science is stuck inside the boundaries of the real world. Philosophy, on the other hand, philosophers sit in their armchairs and use them like spaceships or interdimensional time machines or something, and they whiz out into uncharted territory beyond the universe. Okay, one philosophical answer is called the anthropic principle. It had a great vogue for a while in the 20th century, but nowadays it's not that popular. So again, in brief, we can only ask why anything exists if we exist. Okay, if we didn't exist, we wouldn't be here, nobody would be asking the question. Since we exist, that is why we can ask whether anything exists. And that's the answer. Exactly. What? So basically, the problem with it, and obviously I've put it in its worst possible, people frame it in better ways, okay, in much more convincing ways, but really that's what it boils down to. It basically, okay, let me give you an analogy. Why is there life on Earth? Okay, you can answer that question by the anthropic principle as well. Why is there life on Earth? When we look around the universe with our telescopes, we see that the conditions that exist on Earth are probably incredibly rare. They are very, very rare. There are about 100 factors that are really carefully fine-tuned in order to make the Earth the right habitat for human life to exist. Okay? Now, one answer to that question would be because God created a universe in which there was a planet in which these things could exist. Another answer might be, well, if there are billions and billions of planets in the world, then by sheer chance, one of them is bound to get all of those factors right. And that just happens to be the one that we live on, and that's why we live on Earth, because it's the one that had the right factors for human beings to exist. We couldn't be asking this question on Mars because we would never have existed on Mars. We couldn't be asking this question on Alpha Centauri B because the factors are wrong. We couldn't have arisen on Alpha Centauri B. And therefore, that's the answer to the question of why there is life on Earth. It is because we are here to ask, we are here to be able to ask the question because this is the place where the factors all came together correctly. I'm trying to give it its due presented in a positive way, but I'm having a lot of trouble because it doesn't make sense to me. I don't know. Okay, most people today would agree that the anthropic principle fails because it doesn't actually explain anything. It doesn't actually explain the why. It doesn't answer the why. It's basically another one of those circular arguments. If I wasn't here, I couldn't be asking the question of why I exist. Okay, I exist because I'm asking the question of why I exist. And the two kind of cycle through each other. So basically to say, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, we couldn't ask that question unless we existed. We exist because there is something rather than nothing. Okay, that's the anthropic principle answer or solution to this problem. The fact that we exist proves that there has to be something rather than nothing. That's really the best you could say out of the anthropic principle. Have we answered the question, why is there something rather than nothing? No, we haven't answered it. I've confused you, I can tell. Okay. Really though, what we really want is a cause, an explanation. To explain why something exists, we standardly appeal to the existence of something else. Why do I exist? Because my parents exist. Why do they exist? Because their parents exist. Why do they exist? And so on, and so on, and so on. If you want, all the way back to the Big Bang. And then we put God at the end of that, but we're coming to that. Okay, the atheist would say, okay, if we're going to follow that, you're going to end up with an infinite regress, an unending chain of causation that stretches back without end. And even that's not really going to solve the problem. Okay, I've got some graphics to make this a little bit simpler. Z happens because of Y. Y happens because of X. X happens because of W. And imagine it extending in both directions. Okay, a chain of causation. Things causing other things. Okay, even if we say that, and even if we say, as the scientist feels impelled to say, that this chain is infinite, it has no beginning and it has no end, that still hasn't solved the problem. Because we still have to ask this. Why does any of that exist? Why do the X, Y, Zs and Ws exist in the first place? We need to have another explanation for why the chain itself exists. Let's call that explanation alpha. Why should alpha exist? Well, we're going to have to explain that by beta, which causes alpha. But why do alphas and betas exist? We're going to have to introduce another chain to explain the alpha, beta, gamma, deltas. And then you're going to have another chain to explain that chain. So you end up with an infinite, I don't know what you'd call that, matrix, pyramid, network, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, of unending causality. And in the end, you don't have an answer to the question of why. Why does all of this exist? You are just constantly going back and back and back and back. And to assume that an infinity of things just exists by itself is also really, really hard. Why should that be? That seems, an infinity of things seems to be the most complex thing you can imagine. We said our default starting position is nothing, and that's the simplest thing you can imagine. How do you go from the simplest thing possible to proposing the solution to it is the most complex thing possible? And you just have to take that on faith. You can't prove it. There is no way of explaining why all of these chains should exist. This is the stuff of madness. This is how people go insane, pondering stuff like this. But I don't want you to go insane. So I'm going to suggest another solution that preserves your sanity. Okay, we have two options. Either there's this endless, infinite chains, it should be with a plural, chains of causation, or we can put a stop to this madness. We can put a starting point. And all we have to do is introduce what we will call a first cause, and we'll define this first cause as being uncaused. Great trick, huh? Okay, so the underlying principle of existence itself that needs no cause to exist, because it is in itself, by definition, existence. Okay? I don't think you could even say it's self-causing, because that would suggest that it may not have caused itself, in a sense. It could have had a choice whether to cause itself or not. Okay. This is one of those really complex ideas to get your head around, because we're not used to it. We're used to everything having a cause. What we're talking about is something that has no cause. It just is cause itself. It is existence itself.
Do philosophers agree that there is a first cause to stop this infinite chain of causation?
Philosophers agree that proposing a first cause is one philosophical solution to the problem, but really this is where philosophy and religion overlap, because we didn't get the idea from philosophy, as far as I know. We got it from religion, and the idea existed well before God said to Moses, "I am," well before Plato and Aristotle and all those guys started thinking about these questions. But you could say that it's a philosophical solution. In a sense, I mean, in the old days, they used to say philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. So, like, philosophy is the technique you use to do theology. Nowadays, they've sort of been split apart, and philosophers have gone off and forgotten theology and gone off to do all sorts of other things. But the technique of theology still actually is pretty much philosophy. Okay, now, before we go on to that, we'll leave that for the second half, because I think we need a break. So before we go on to that, I'll leave you to ponder this concept. Maybe you might like to chat and argue over the beautiful snacks that are outside, the highly attractive snacks that are outside. You might like to discuss, does this really solve the problem, or is there a major problem with this solution? Can we come up with a better solution, or does it really work? Okay, we'll meet again in 15 or 20 minutes. Okay, let's make a start on part 2. Okay, so we said that philosophy comes up with this endless chain, this infinite chain without beginning or end, and probably many chains on top of each other of things causing other things, and that is not going to lead us to an answer to our question of why is there something rather than nothing. Really, we're kind of looking at all of those chains and asking, why do all of them exist? We're going to have to look for a cause outside that chain of causality, something that's a bit different. Okay, so what is the other option? The other option is an uncaused first cause, the underlying principle itself. Now, unless you introduce this kind of religious concept, or as we were saying, I mean, it is also a philosophical concept, unless you introduce it, it seems that you don't have any other alternative than the infinite chain of causation. Before we go on to the religious answer then, would anyone like to make any comments or bring up any issues or ask any questions? Yes, please do. And please use the microphone so people hear you.
The snacks was pretty good.
The snacks were good? Okay. I may have oversold them slightly, but I'm glad you enjoyed them. As winter comes, we probably need to bring in a hot water jug or something and offer you coffee and tea. See if we can work on that. Okay, anything else of less importance than the snacks? Yes, go ahead.
Just wanted to ask about the infinite causation. What is there any reason to reject that as a possibility?
Okay,
philosophically speaking?
Let's throw that question open, shall we, for discussion. Why not just accept that this is the case? Why not accept that there is just an infinite chain of causation? Chain upon chain, chain upon chain.
Like, may as well accept everything else. If you don't question this one.
What do you mean? What do you mean by everything else?
Like, we don't really have to seek answers to anything else. I think it's a core thing. It's a core question, core issue.
So are you saying you're happy with this infinite chain? We don't need to find any other solution?
No.
Or are you saying if you do accept it, then you're basically just giving up?
No, I'm against accepting it. I'm against seeking an answer. Sorry, I am for seeking an answer.
Okay. So why? What don't you like about this? Go ahead, Richard.
With the infinite cause, the causation there, I think that removes having that first cause, that uncaused thing. I mean, having the infinite, I don't think there'd be any room for, from a religious perspective, of a creator, because who created the creator? And
but that's exactly what the atheist wants to show, that you don't need a creator. So have they succeeded? What's wrong with the infinite chain of causation? Yeah, okay, but can we whiz a microphone back there? Or whiz a reggae up to the front?
Slightly from that question, but would it make a difference if instead of there was one source, there would be multiple sources for the first cause, or?
Ooh, now we're complicating things.
Yeah.
More than one God?
Yeah.
See, now we're getting into like the pagan idea, you know. The Romans had a whole mountain of gods.
Would that be less efficient? Or is there a standard to judge between those?
Let me throw it back at you. Is multiple causes a better answer than a single cause?
I would say no.
Why not? You're going to have to justify it.
There's the theory, there's Occam's razor, where it's better to simplify things for the answer than to complicate things. But also, I'm just playing devil's advocate, so.
Yeah. Michael was shaking his head. Do you want to offer a thought? Just makes it more complicated.
multiple dimensions, multiple.
Yeah.
Just keep going at the same chain, but multiply it by
Okay. Let's think about it. Let's say we have multiple gods, and they're the things that bring into existence everything that exists. Now we have to explain each of them. Why does each of them exist? Can we apply the same solution that we applied with the uncaused first cause and say all of them are uncaused first causes? Will that work? Yeah? Microphone.
We said earlier that the first cause would have to be, in a way, the definition of existence, so that would mean that there are multiple existences, which really doesn't make any sense.
I like that, yeah, I agree. It actually doesn't make sense, because it's like saying there are, I don't know, what's an analogy? There are multiple, I don't know, number lines. Are there multiple number lines? No, a number line is a really basic, simple concept of, 1, 2, 3. Sure, you can call them different names, but whatever names you call the numbers, whether it's 1, 2, 3, or I don't know any other languages, واحد اثنين ثلاثة, okay, or whatever you want to call them, the basic concept is still there. You can't say there is more than one number line. There is just one number line. It's a really basic core concept. And that's really what we're talking about here when we talk about a first cause, isn't it? A basic core concept. You can't have multiple basic core concepts. You can't have multiple beginnings. There's one beginning. One thing begins everything else. So the idea of multiple gods or multiple first causes seems to fail. We still haven't answered the infinite causation, no beginning. What is there to dislike about that? Well, how would you argue against that?
Because it just goes against how we know existence comes to be. At one point there is no human being, then there is. At one point there is no, I don't know, tree, and you plant it. So we as humans are conditioned to think that there is always some form of beginning to everything that has a reality.
Yeah.
And so to go back to keep rolling back in time or keep rolling back in thinking to get to an uncaused, it just everything crumbles.
Yeah.
There is no foundation to how we live our life.
Yeah, we haven't really answered the question. Not only that, but just to add to what you're saying, Michael, science itself has kind of given us that same, it's reinforced what you're talking about. You remember when we talked about the Big Bang, we said that the major competitor to the Big Bang theory before they had enough evidence to tell them apart was called the steady state theory, which posited an infinite universe, a universe without a beginning, a universe that has always existed. And yet, that's been shown to be wrong. It's not that it's impossible. Once again, we can imagine the concept, we can think about the concept, but reality turned out not to be like that. Reality turned out the universe itself screamed at us, if I can use some poetic language, I have a beginning. I started. I have not always been here. And that in itself sort of reinforces that intuition that you're talking about, that the idea of something like a universe doesn't have in itself the character of being infinite. Okay, so all that we know of the universe, all of this chain of causality that we're talking about, every X, Y, Z, alpha, beta, whatever else, everything in it, every single entity in it, gives us no clue whatsoever that it is something that could be without cause. What we're actually positing, and why a first cause answer is better, I think, is we are positing something that has a different nature to all of these things. It is not just different in quantity, but its very quality is different. It's something that is completely different. And it's something that we can't imagine and understand with our brains, something that has no cause in itself. But the good thing about it is it answers the question for us. Sorry, go ahead, Albert, if we can get a microphone.
Logically incoherent, because if you think about it, they're all contingent effects, so the cause must have had, and like the effect must have had a cause, and that, as you go back, that cause was an effect by another cause. So with the other theory, you compile the whole universe and all those causes into one, and you have an external uncaused cause, as you said, I suppose. So that's why I guess it makes more sense.
That's a good answer. I like that. And of course, as you know, scientists have tried to avoid that by positing a multiverse where there is a cause of our universe outside of our universe, as you just said, but it's not an uncaused cause, it's just another universe, and so on and so on. But really, if you think about it, that's just making the universe bigger, and it's not really answering the question. It's just pushing the question further back, further out, and it still hasn't. And really, that's what's going on here. We're just pushing the question away. We're not answering it. Okay, any other thoughts or comments? Thank you for that. That's, you know, please share. You're saying wonderful things. Please don't be shy. Get involved. Anything else? Anybody want to add?
Maybe because if you don't answer that question, then there will be plenty of other stuff contingent or based on that, on the answer to that initial question, like how come we're functioning the way we're functioning? I don't know. I'm just following my intuition.
Yeah, I mean, that is another one of those big unanswered questions which we might one day look at, which is, why should the universe be the way that it is and not some other way?
Yeah, and the laws, all the laws of nature, everything that science is discovering and has discovered. I don't know.
And that too is a question that science can't answer because it's outside the circle of reality that we're talking about. Okay. Let's move on. Can religion give us a logical and rational framework in which existence makes sense? Okay. Science seems to be incapable. Philosophy seems to have failed without God. Can God solve the problem for us? Let's have a look at the religious answer. Okay, some religions have grappled with this question, but interestingly, most religions haven't. Isn't that interesting? Most religions throughout the history of the world have just started with the assumption that things exist. Okay, a lot of religions have creation myths that are different to the Christian, Judaic, Muslim one. So things like, how did the world exist? Well, there was a primordial ocean, and the world was an island that came up in the middle of the ocean. Where did the ocean come from? You can't ask that. It was just there. Okay. The universe was an egg, and the egg broke open and the sun came out and the moon came out and the earth came out. Where did the egg come from? It was just there. Okay. What's the problem with these? Eggs and primordial oceans don't have the property of being uncaused. They are things that are always caused. Eggs come from birds. Okay. Oceans come when water accumulates in one place. Okay. The monotheistic solution gives a different answer. Okay. It proposes not an egg or an ocean, but an uncaused cause, which we're going to look at in a little while. And Orthodox Christianity in particular, and we're going to see how the Orthodox concept of God, I think, answers this question better than the Western, Protestant Catholic type of concept of God. We'll see why. So the answer for the monotheist is the uncreated God. To avoid the infinite change of causation, we must posit a first link, a first cause. Why is the first cause uncaused? Because it has to be. It's defined as such. This must be its nature if it's to be a true first cause. Are we cheating when we do that? Are we rigging the question? Are we fudging? You remember the fudge factor? In science, they use fudge factors a lot. Okay, and it works. In science, it actually works. You know Einstein's famous fudge factor? You know about this? He introduced this constant called K, which was a kind of a repellent force, like gravity is an attractive force. Things get sucked into it. To make his equations work, he introduced a force that repels in order to balance out his equations and make his theory work at one stage. And then later on he chopped it out and he got rid of it, and he called it the biggest mistake of his life. And then people discovered this thing called inflation, which actually showed his fudge factor worked and it was necessary, and it actually is a part of reality. And so now it's been reintroduced, and it's part of, you know, our modern concept of how the universe works. So fudge factors are really common in science, and they work. You see the need for something, you kind of see a hole of a certain shape, so you hypothesize. You suggest that maybe there is an object that fits the hole and has that shape. And usually that works because the hole is there for a reason. And the reason is because something fits it, something fits in it. And that's really what we're doing here. We're seeing reality exists. How could it start? What is the underlying cause of it? Well, the underlying cause of it has this shape of an uncaused first cause. So we're going to hypothesize that there is such a thing that fills that hole. And as we will see, I hope, I think we can say there are good reasons for believing that our suggestion is actually true. And one of those reasons is because if we didn't have this first cause, really nothing should exist. We should not be here to be asking this question. Think of it this way. And I've labeled this an excessively simplified analogy, which is probably an understatement. Okay, you set up the dominoes. Okay, all very good. Think of the dominoes as the events that happen in reality, the things that happen in reality. None of them is going to drop. None of those events are going to happen unless something pushes the first domino. You can set it up as intricately as you like. You can make it as beautiful as you like, but none of it is going to happen unless something pushes that thing. If you walk into a room and find this beautiful pattern of dominoes all lying on their sides, you cannot escape the conclusion that something pushed. Something started them falling. Okay. Someone just laid them out like that. Okay. Actually, that's a good point. I never thought of that. Okay, so it's the same thing. Someone had to put them there on their sides. You see, actually, this is a really good illustration of the logic of this, okay? And it really does seem to be inescapable. You cannot escape the fact that there has to be this first cause, because if the first cause doesn't exist, nothing should exist. Okay, what made them emerge? What made them emerge as dominoes rather than flowers? Okay, who designed the something about them and made it their character? How did they come to have that character? Okay, so now we're back to assuming that everything is just self-inherent, which is kind of like having an infinite number of first causes. We're back to that, which we said before doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't make sense. But good try, may I say. Excellent effort. 100% for effort. Sorry, you're going to say something, Marianne? You want to think about it a bit more? Okay. Okay. Now, why should we accept a religious answer? The atheist may say, okay, we haven't got a scientific answer yet, but there are lots of things in the past where people didn't have a scientific answer, and then 100 years later they did. How do we know that in 100 years' time there won't be a scientific answer to this question? Mina's shaking his head disappointedly. Just use the microphone.
I think we discussed that this is not something that science can ever explain because it's not something scientific. It's not something you could set up an experiment to observe. It's something that requires explanation rather than description. So yeah, it's completely out of the field of science.
Yeah, so no matter how far science advances, by its very nature, it is simply not equipped to answer this kind of question. We are not going to find the answer to this question in science.
Just on that point as well, I could always just, as a theist, there's no point saying in the future science is going to prove me right, because I could say the same as a theist and say, oh yeah, in the future we're going to be so scientifically advanced and we're going to be able to prove that this is the case. So I think it's meaningless to talk about what science is going to be present in the future. We can only discuss what evidence we have today, because I can say anything about the future. It doesn't really mean anything today, though.
It's a good point. It's an argument that can cut both ways. Both sides can use it to support their view. So in the end, maybe those two cancel each other out. Yeah.
Because by that very definition, they've created something to explain a cause. So do you get what I'm saying?
No, you're going to need to elaborate.
Like, by trying to prove that there was no first cause, they've created something to cause that experiment. Like, it's an ironic thing that they're causing something to explain the non-cause of something.
So,
is anyone following?
I think I'm getting closer. Are you saying that the theory that things pop out of a vacuum?
No, like, eventually, they're saying that eventually they will develop some sort of theory or explanation to explain that there was no first cause.
Yeah.
But science is causing that to prove their point. It's like disrefuting themselves.
Kind of like a paradox kind of thing, a contradiction. Yeah. Okay. That's all right. That's all right. I'll take that one as a comment. Okay, can we get a microphone back there, though, please? If we can. Thank you. Just switch it on.
Okay, so then why doesn't... I can buy that there is something that exists, but the created bit, why does there something have... Why does there have to be someone that creates it? Why can't it just be random things popping up and smashing into each other and then you have a universe?
Okay, think of what you just said. Random things popping up. Okay, how, what decides which random thing comes up? There must be some kind of mechanism, some kind of process. Where did that process come from?
Actually, you know what? Because that is ordered. Actually, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, in and out. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't work. Yeah, it doesn't work for an ordered.
Yeah. Once again, 100% for effort. Good try. But look, I think that's really good, because are you getting a feel for the fact that this is kind of an inescapable conclusion, that there has to be a first cause? That's what I'm trying to communicate. It's kind of, you can come at it from any side you want. You can try and find any kind of, strategy to try and answer this question. But in the end, it seems you keep ending up in the same place, that you can't avoid the uncaused first cause, which you just have to define. It's defined that way. There's no other way to do it. Yeah. Just wait for the microphone.
So have we officially dismissed science as a way of, as something to provide answers? Because I was thinking maybe if you keep asking how, that will answer the why.
Interesting idea. If you ask a lot of how questions, might you end up with the why? Do you think that would work? Is it possible?
Why not? That's what I'm asking.
Anyone want to answer?
Well, so just moving back one step to that. So what you're using, science, works. The question, before I even need to jump to all the infinite number of hows that you'd like to go to, would be, why does science work?
We don't know. I don't know why it works, but I'm saying is if we keep asking how.
But then you're relying on science to give you an answer, so science must work.
Because there's nothing else. I'm just like, when you're following something, like just follow his lead or her lead until maybe they will take you somewhere.
Okay. Okay, let me use another analogy. Imagine somehow my laptop was flung into space, flew in space for thousands of years, and arrived on another planet where an alien race found it. And they don't have computers. So they're really curious about this object. So they ask all the how questions. How does it work? What does it do? They discover this thing called electricity and electronic circuits and buttons and screens and things. Is it possible for them, by asking all of these how questions and working out how it works, to answer the question of why does it exist?
Question of why we use laptops.
Okay, they don't know anything about me. They don't know where it's come from. For them, it just came out of space, came out of nowhere. They have no idea where it came from.
So the question becomes, why does a laptop exist?
Yeah.
Or why does the owner of the laptop exist? I'm confused.
They don't know if there's an owner even. They have no way of knowing. Maybe it's just a strange phenomenon that happens near black holes.
Yeah, I think if they do discover the circuits and everything, then it will answer why a laptop exists. A laptop exists to type things on, to do research on it, the very purpose of the laptop is discovered, and that's why it exists.
But why would you do those things? Would it help them, for example, okay, let's say they do that and they find a file on it that has a Shakespeare play. Okay. What's the point of a Shakespeare play? To my mind, they wouldn't be able to work that out. Okay, they'd have to decipher the language, probably, and understand how the language works, but I don't know. In the end, I don't know, or is that a bad analogy, or does that actually prove your point, maybe?
Yeah, it does
it
does prove my point, because whatever they make of its functions, that answers their why question of why does a laptop exist. It's based on how they use it, its functions, what they discover about it. So yeah, that works in my favor, actually.
It does seem to work in your favor. Yeah, go ahead.
May I say that it doesn't actually answer your question. Your question was why. Well, the question posed was why, but what we've given are descriptions of what it can do, rather than explain why it exists.
Yeah,
you've defined it's got certain properties, certain characteristics, and it can be used this way. None of these, almost, they're qualitative to a certain extent, but they don't account for the reason it exists.
But the very reason it exists, so it can be used that way.
I think I found out why. Why? I think I